The Bible contains a lot of inspirational stories in it, but in all honesty, it also has plenty of disturbing content in it. That's hard for us as believers or seekers or even as critics to kind of square with this idea of God being a God of love, and particularly those stories in the Old Testament where we read about God commanding the Israelites to destroy the nations surrounding them. And so that is kind of awfully problematic for us sometimes. My guest here with me today is the fella who has literally written the book on this topic. We'll be talking to him in just a moment. I'm Kerry Decker, your host for this session. We'll be right back. My guest is Paul Copan, and he is the Pletcher Family Chair philosopher. I guess the Pletcher Family Chair Endowed Department of Philosophy and Ethics at, hang on, I think I can get it, West Palm Beach Atlantic University. Did I get that right?
Nearly there, yeah. Palm Beach Atlantic University.
All right.
Pletcher Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics.
There you go. You know, I knew you could get it right even if I didn't. So, well, I'm so honored to have this opportunity to visit with you a little bit on this topic of, is God a moral monster? Dr. Copan, give me the Cliff Notes version of why we need to think deeper about this topic than just the surface level objections that we oftentimes hear from skeptics.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, Kerry. I think in terms of some preliminaries, it might be helpful to keep in mind that if God does command something, he would have morally justifiable reason for doing so. Doesn't mean that those commands are easy. Sometimes there are difficult commands in Scripture. But if there could be commands that would be impossible for God to give, given his good and just nature, he would not do so. He would not issue those commands. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so we need to distinguish between difficult commands and impossible commands. Yeah. And so this is something that we are talking about having morally justifiable reason for doing so. Mm-hmm. And also that means that when we're dealing with these sorts of commands, it's not as though this is the sort of thing that God delights in doing. This is a matter of getting one's hands dirty, doing something that one would rather not do. But because of what is at stake, that these commands are being issued. Now, the question comes, was this a command to engage in genocide? Well, I think there are reasons to disagree with that very concept as being part of God's command. Of course, if you're dealing with, say, Nazis, if you're dealing, I think we should think when we're dealing with some of the Canaanite peoples or the Amalekites in Scripture, we should probably think more along the lines of Nazis than innocent civilians minding their own business, not bothering anybody, not being a negative influence. No, we're dealing with something much more significant than that, something more grave than that.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy on that. Let me interrupt just for a moment, because we can understand warfare against combatants, but doesn't God command in the Scriptures the utter annihilation of some of these people, even their kids?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. Is this a matter of genocide? And what I want to do is certainly admit that, yes, people were killed, but the way warfare operates in really any sort of a setting is that those who are not going to be engaged in fighting get out of the way. People generally leave if they know that war is looming. Also, keep in mind, too, that we have a greater kind of a heightened sensitivity to warfare in our day than what was going on back in the ancient Near East when war was assumed. It was just, things were, war was a way of life back then. If you didn't engage in warfare, your nation perished. Or you might align yourself with a militarily superior nation in order to have some kind of protection from another nation that could be a military threat and so forth. So we tend to be much more squeamish, just even when it comes to even eating meat, for example. I just did a book called What Would Jesus Really Eat? And it talks about questions of how people say, oh, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we'd all be vegetarians or vegans. Well, slaughtering animals and used to be a way of life. People used to have farms, they would kill animals and so forth, and we in our suburban or urban settings, that's so far removed from us, and we are squeamish, and maybe we think, oh, I've got a pet too, I would want to do that to my animal. Yeah. And so we kind of have this reserve about it, but again, back in the day when we had many more farms in this land, it was just a way of life to kill what was in the barnyard and bring it to the dinner table later that day. Yeah. So I think in the same way there is a certain squeamishness about warfare, and I'm not saying that everything that was done was in the ancient Near East was pleasant or something like that. For people back then. But I'm just saying that it was just part of the mindset, part of the fabric, part of the way people operated, that war was, you just prepared for war, you protected yourself and so forth. Again, a far cry from what we have today. Yeah. But that said, let me just say a few things about genocide. Genocide presupposes typically a certain inherently ethnic or national or tribal entity here. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind that the Israelites were from the basic genetic stock as the Canaanites. So you'd put them side by side, they would be identical. They'd wear the same clothes, look the same, speak the same language, and so forth. So the problem wasn't DNA. The problem was disobedience. The problem was that they engaged in certain acts that would be considered criminal in any civilized society. Infant sacrifice, bestiality, ritual prostitution, incest. And keep in mind, too, that this wasn't some precipitous judgment, some rash move. God told Abraham over 500 years before it happened, he said he was going to wait until the sin of the Amorite, one of the Canaanite peoples, was filled up or had reached capacity, as it were. So the time needed to be ripe. Otherwise, it would have been premature for the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan. Mm-hmm. And also, too, as we read the book of Joshua, we see a Canaanite like Rahab who actually joins up with the Israelite peoples. We see some Canaanite strangers who are at a covenant renewal ceremony in Joshua chapter 8. They are there, part of this, in probably the town of Shechem. And we see even the Gibeonites who, though through deception, they become part of the people of God, and they're incorporated into the fabric of Israel. So again, we see that it is not so much an ethnic or tribal issue, so much as it is the kind of pernicious influence that the Canaanites were, that they were a destructive influence, and Israel, being a fledgling nation, was in the position where their own identity and mission to bring salvation, to be a light to the nations, again, ultimately through Jesus the Messiah, that their mission could be well compromised, and again was often on the verge of being compromised repeatedly, if they capitulated, engaging in sexual immorality or breaking their treaty with Yahweh, with God, and joining themselves up with other ancient Near Eastern deities like Baal and so forth, would have utterly ruined the mission. So there's a lot at stake here. And so perhaps the severity of these commands is largely connected to the fact that this nation, just in the blossom stage, could easily have been snuffed out in terms of its own mission and identity.
Yeah.
So that the whole issue of ethnicity, I think, needs to be put in proper context here. We're not talking about genocide. We're talking about something that's related to behavior, lifestyle, to a pernicious influence here. So that's one thing that I want to keep in mind.
Yeah. Help me to connect the dots here for a moment, because obviously that you're painting a picture of these Canaanite people as being some pretty, I guess, unsavory characters. When Israel came in, did they then wipe them off of the face of the map and utterly destroy them like the scriptures commanded?
Right. That's my second point. I'm glad you asked. So the first has to do with ethnicity versus behavior. That's really what is at issue, and the pernicious influence. Secondly is that of hyperbole. When we read terms like utterly destroy, or we left no survivor, we left alive nothing that breathed, these are stock phrases in ancient Near Eastern war texts. It was like ancient Near Eastern trash talk. We use that in sports, for example, when you say, oh, we totally annihilated those guys. We don't take that literally. And as you read ancient Near Eastern war texts, you see that the Egyptians, the Assyrians and so forth, the Moabites, use the same type of language, saying that Israel is no more, or Syria is no more. The Arameans are no more. That they would use that sort of language. They were as dust, as though as they never existed, and so forth. They'd use that sort of language, but we know from history that those sorts of claims were far from literally true. Sometimes you might have a narrow victory, and you might say we totally annihilated them. We totally destroyed them. We left alive nothing that breathes. Pharaoh Ramses III, in fighting against the Philistines and other sea peoples, talked about how they were as though they didn't exist anymore. Turns out that the Philistines actually came in and took over the eastern part of Egypt later on. So even though the language is used that they totally don't exist, they've been annihilated, they actually came in and were served as a serious threat to Egypt on its eastern front. So again, that sort of language of utterly destroy, we have to be very careful about. In fact, when you read that kind of language, the term utterly destroy, I think we have to be very careful about how we translate that. John and Harvey Walton, in their book on the Israelite conquest, talk about how the term utterly destroy is not a good rendering for the term haram and the noun cherem, utter destruction. It has to, because you can have some things that are, or even persons that are haram or cherem, but they're not destroyed. In fact, in Leviticus 27, a person is dedicated to tabernacle service. A servant is haram, but he's not killed. He's not utterly destroyed. He is dedicated to service to God. So basically, the idea here is that it is removed from ordinary use, or it's there's a certain sense of identity removal. That which gave identity has been removed. And they use the example of Nazi Germany, where when the Allied forces sought to remove the identity of Nazism in order to restore the nation to becoming a flourishing democratic nation, removing that Nazi influence, they killed those who were in charge. They removed all the symbols. They vilified the ideology. All of these things they removed, which had been the part of the Germanic identity. Yeah. And so you have, yes, there were people who were killed. Perhaps, there were even civilians who were killed in the fighting and so forth. But fundamentally, the German people remained intact. But the identity was harem. It was removed. It was no longer what gave them their identity. And so when you read like Deuteronomy 7, it looks like God is more interested in removing all the things that could be a temptation to the Israelites to become a basis of idolatrous identity. Mm-hmm. So you're to destroy the altars, the shrines, and idols and so forth. You're to remove all of those things so that they don't ensnare you. Because even in Deuteronomy 7, it talks about utterly destroying. It says you drive them out, you defeat them, utterly destroy them, etc. And then it says don't engage in alliances with them, don't make treaties with them, don't intermarry with them. Well, if you've already destroyed them, then what does that mean? Well, then it goes on to talk about destroying all of their altars, their pillars, their shrines, and so forth. Yeah. So that's one thing to keep in mind when it comes to, we're dealing with hyperbole here. And we also keep in mind, too, that a lot of times when you see this language of utter destruction, or however that's to be rendered, remove the identity or to significantly defeat someone, even though we haven't utterly annihilated them, there are a lot of people who are often surviving this alleged annihilation. You'll see them sometimes appearing in the same verse, the same chapter, or later on in the book, where the people who have been utterly destroyed in a city, a few chapters later in the book of Joshua, there they are again, in Hebron, or other places. They are still there, the town of Devere. So you see that this is happening, and you see even at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua says that there are many other nations that still need to be driven out. But it says in the book of Joshua repeatedly that Joshua did all that Moses commanded. Yeah. Now, if he did all that Moses commanded, and there are plenty of survivors, then it becomes clear that there is hyperbole here. Yeah. Now, some people might say, but the Israelites were supposed to drive them out. They were supposed to get rid of them. They were supposed to annihilate them, and they didn't do that, and that's why they became a thorn in their side and so forth. Well, if you just look at the text of Joshua, Joshua is one who is obedient to the command of Moses to utterly destroy, whatever that means, to remove their identity. So it says he did all that Moses commanded. So if you're following the text, you see that there must be some kind of hyperbole or exaggeration here in order to account for Joshua's faithfulness to Moses' command to whatever utterly destroy means. Yeah. So those are a few things that we ought to remember as we look at these sorts of texts. There are plenty of people left alive, but yet that term is used and applied to these populations that they were utterly destroyed. Yeah. So that's a second point to keep in mind.
Yeah. You mentioned a little bit ago about modern sensitivities, even with respect to eating meat and things of that nature. I'm reminded my wife's grandmother. She was just a little bitty thing, and she would tell about how she'd go out in the backyard and grab a chicken by its head and spin it around until its head popped off, and then drained the blood out of it and plucked it. And my wife oftentimes says that if she had to do that, she probably would become a vegan. And that concept of modern sensibilities with respect to ancient warfare seems to be problematic for so many people in our time. Even if it was messy, and warfare normally is pretty messy. Yes, we like to have clinical warfare now, but even if it were messy, doesn't God have the right, the prerogative to judge people?
Sure, that is definitely the understanding that you see in that comes out very clearly in the scriptures. When you look at Amos, for example, chapters 1 and 2, God is pronouncing judgment upon nations surrounding Israel before he gets to Israel and the northern kingdom and then southern kingdom of Judah themselves. He said he's going to send fire. Why? Because there are nations that are stifling compassion, that they are ripping open pregnant women to expand their borders. They are breaking treaties and so forth. They're doing all sorts of things that they ought to have known better than to do. And so God is going to hold them responsible. God is going to bring judgment upon them. So there's a general revelation, a general awareness that people ought to have known better in the ancient Near East. In fact, when you read in Hebrews 11 about Rahab and Jericho, it says that Rahab didn't perish with those who are disobedient. So there's this sense of a moral law that is knowingly being violated. In fact, even as you read in the book of Joshua and also in 1 Samuel, you read repeatedly that the Canaanites were aware of the power of God. They were aware that this God was greater than the gods of the Egyptians, that he led the Israelites out through the Red Sea, crossing the Jordan River and so forth, that there were these plagues on Egypt, and again, if you just even wanted to look at the camp of the Israelites, you'd see this pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, leading the people of Israel onward. So you'd see there is something very definitive and very distinctive about the Israelites' God that ought to put people on notice. So there is this awareness that yes, this God is one with whom everyone has to do. And so, yes, God does have the right to bring judgment. And of course, the question is, what about women and children? What about the non-combatants? And warfare is messy. It's not as though things are tidy. But as I said, the general tendency is that those who are in the line of fire, as it were, would be, if they're non-combatants, they would be the first to leave if there's a known battle that's going to be fought.
Yeah.
And basically the strategy that the Israelites are using as they go into these places, and again, this is a third thing to keep in mind, is that it's a two-stage operation. They go into these cities, and most of them are really citadel cities. They tend to be more, either like royal cities. They tend to be more where the military and government sorts of centers are. The people aren't generally staying in these areas. But basically, the Israelites go to these places, they drive out the inhabitants, and then they go back to their base camp at Gilgal. And those cities then become harem cities. They become, it doesn't mean that they're utterly destroyed. There are only 3 cities that are utterly destroyed by fire, Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. Those are the 3 cities. Otherwise, they're just kind of left open for the Israelites eventually to inhabit. So they're not utterly destroyed. But if people, Canaanites, go back to those cities to try to re-inhabit them, man, woman, or child, then they are leaving themselves open to military action. Sure. They become vulnerable. So those harem cities are to be removed from use. But if they're reoccupied, then those people are putting their lives in their own hands. So those are some things that are part of the picture here. And keep in mind that this is a unique set of warfare regulations related to the Canaanites because of their pernicious influence, that this is highly regulated, it is temporary, it is something that is only for these people who have this kind of influence. But for other nations, their warfare regulations take on another level, more like kind of our just war sort of arrangements that we have in our day. It's more comparable to that at any rate. So as I said, the reason for the greater severity with the Canaanites is precisely because of the pernicious influence that they were exerting, and that also threatened the mission and identity of Israel. So there is, as someone has put it, in a sense, a short-term, targeting of Canaanites, so that their threat would be removed. But again, the ultimate goal is the long-range benefit to the entire world, including the Canaanites. In fact, Jesus himself meets up with a Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15, so as to come full circle, that salvation is intended for all who would be willing to receive it. I think what the real issue is in the land of Canaan is, are people willing to cooperate with who God is? Are they willing to identify with him? Or are they going to resist who this God is, about whom they know very well? So there are these sorts of dynamics that also are part of the bigger picture of what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, again, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy.
Okay.
Is that you talk about this being a short-term policy of the nation of Israel. But don't we see the same kind command resurfaced during the reign of King Saul when he is commanded to utterly destroy the Amalekites there? Dr. Copen has plenty of great content to share. Hear his answer to this question and the other points that he makes with respect to this topic of, is God a moral monster? Catch his second interview here on 5 Good Reasons Why God Exists. We'll see you next time.